on the room. Okay, it must be that we are good on the tech. So good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for another fun-filled, exciting lecture on converts to Judaism. Tonight will be no exception for what we've had. It'll be it's going to be a thriller. I mean, as far as like it can be a thriller, we're going to make it a thriller. But it is definitely we are treading into I don't know if controversial is the right word or just interesting or whatever word we'll use. But we are getting into a very interesting area tonight. Because we were a little on the politically correct side when we originally put out the title. The title was originally put out as the Roman converts, which will be the general idea that we'll be covering, the idea of the Roman converts and people in the Roman Empire who converted to Judaism. But we're going to see that there are. The timing of this was very interesting and led to a very interesting time for the Jewish people. So I want to thank you all for joining us on this fun-filled night, and I want to thank those who are watching on Facebook, YouTube, here on Zoom, and later on TorahAnytime.com. So with no further ado, let's get started. Somebody, by the way, I got a private message that there was a complaint that my volume is a little low. Is anyone else having trouble hearing me? Anyone else? Okay. So if anyone does, please just turn your volume up. I guess it's on maybe on your end. I don't see in my audio settings that anything that indicates it's off. But be it as it may, tonight we are discussing the converts of Rome and really how Rome was maybe this close, but definitely close to actually becoming a Jewish empire. We all know that Rome ended up becoming the Holy Roman Empire, became a Christian empire, and when they embraced Christianity. But we're going to see tonight that sort of the landscape that came into and how the empire was actually quite close to embracing Judaism, and how there are many famous, great Romans, people of Roman aristocracy, people of the Roman hierarchy, even Roman emperors who converted to Judaism. And that is where we are going to tread tonight. We're also going to see how this is somewhat connected to Inyoni D'Yoma on the Jewish calendar. We will see that in a moment as well. Inyoni D'Yoma means happenings on the Jewish calendar. So we're going to see it's very apropos, the timing of tonight's discussion on the Jewish calendar, with tonight being the onset of the 8th of the month of Teves. Okay, so let's jump into it. So the problem that we have to start with, we have a problem that's kind of baffled historians for generations. And there's a good amount of papers, a good amount of academic papers written on this topic. And many historians have different ways of dealing with it. But it's a problem that when we look at the numbers of the Jewish people, that's the world Jewish population, at the time of the destruction of the first temple, so roughly 420 before the Common Era, 420, 422 before the Common Era, there were roughly 500,000 Jews in the world at that point. Now, where does that number come from? It comes from a number of places, but the main source of our number is going to be Josephus. And because Josephus in a number of places writes on the Jewish populations from Jewish times, and most historians are of the opinion that Josephus is, well, there's parts of Josephus we take issues with. The population numbers that he gives are usually pretty accurate. So Josephus gives a number of about, a couple 100,000 up to maybe 500,000 if we extend in some other ideas at the time of the destruction of the first temple. Now, that's a pretty small number, let's face it. Not to mention, it was probably down to about 10% of what the first Commonwealth was at its height. At the time of David and Solomon, the first Commonwealth was probably up to about 5 million Jews. But again, if you follow the Book of Kings and some of the things we've discussed here in these sessions, there was a lot that happened between David and Solomon and the destruction of the temple, most notably the splitting of the kingdom and the eventual exile of the the northern kingdom. So we know that the northern kingdom sent into exile long before the southern kingdom, and the inhabitants, the populace of the northern kingdom, is essentially lost from the Jewish people. Now, I say essentially lost because they're not completely lost, because we understand that Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah, at the time of the destruction of the first temple, made great efforts to reach out to and to find any of the remnants of the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom that he could find, and to bring them into the Babylonian exile with the Jewish people. So even though we know that it was only the southern kingdom, which is the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, survive, we understand from our sages in the Talmud that there are remnants of all of the 10 tribes that were embraced into the Babylonian Jewish community, and some of which go back for the second temple. But be it as it may, we have a number of about 500,000, if we're being generous, 500,000 Jews at the time of the Babylonian exile. Now, let's fast forward a little bit to the time of the destruction of the second temple, the aftermath of the destruction of the second temple, so roughly 1st, 2nd century of the Common Era. So, so how many Jews are in the world at that point? And again, at this point, we'll lay on Josephus, but we don't only have to lay on Josephus because we have other historians at this point who are calculating this. We have the Roman historian Dio Cassius, and we have others. So we have, at this point, we can corroborate the numbers of Josephus with other historians, and other historians put the number of the world Jewish population, or the population of the Jews in the Roman Empire, which was essentially the world, at upwards of 8 to 10 million. Now, that is quite a population growth if you think about it. How long is there from the destruction of the first temple to the destruction of the second temple? Well, the second temple stood for 420 years, 70 years Babylonian exile, roughly 490, 500 years. So what we're essentially saying is, according to reliable historical sources, there were somewhere in the neighborhood of 500,000 Jews in the world in the year 420 before the Common Era, and roughly 500 years later, in the year, we'll say 70 of the Common Era and the destruction of the Second Temple, there are 8 to 10 million Jews in the world. Now, this was not a time when it wasn't like we can look and see certain attributes like life expectancy going up, because that was not the case. Life expectancy was roughly the same under the Greeks, Persians, Romans. Maybe a little better under the Romans, but not enough to not enough to account for this, but there's a huge discrepancy. So what historians agree on is the numbers, that it was at one point the destruction of the first temple, roughly 500,000 Jews, probably a little less. At the destruction of the second temple or thereafter, about 8 to 10 million Jews. The numbers, I don't want to say are undisputed, because everything in history, especially from 2,000 years ago, is disputed. But definitely the overwhelming opinion amongst historians is the numbers are accurate. The question is, Asma, like how did that happen? How do you have such a major population growth of the Jewish people, and it happens through very tumultuous times? I mean, let's look at what happens from the destruction of the first temple till the destruction of the second temple. You have the Hanukkah War. You have major civil wars. You have numerous civil wars amongst the Jews. You have the Romans, Herod. I mean, you have so much against the Jews, and still at this point, we see the major population growth. So the question is, what led to this thing? Now, I'll point on an interesting just tidbit of greater Jewish history. Is here you look at, we were roughly 8 to 10 million Jews strong 2,000 years ago. And how many Jews are there in the world today? Depending on how you count, 8 to 10 million, 10 to 12 million, maybe some will say 14 million, but not much more than not much more than what we have today. Now, by comparison, by comparison, at the same time period of the, roughly the year 2000, there were about the same number of Jews in the world as there were Chinese. Okay? Today, there's 1,500,000,000 Chinese in the world. They round off to more than we are, and we're still like, I don't know, 10 to 12 million. So it's interesting that at the same time, there's just as many Chinese as Jews, maybe a few more Chinese, but not many more. And today they've just had, they just continue to grow like wildfire, and we're still like, a handful of a million. So the question is, what happened? How did you have such a tremendous population growth of Jews? I had a question here that Ron asked. Good question about how does it compare to other groups? Not similar. It's not correlated. So if we want to look at environmental, if we want to look at life expectancy, general population growth, we don't find it in other areas of the Roman Empire. Yet we see that Jews grew whatever it is, 20-fold during this time period. So where did it come from? So it's not life expectancy. It's not, it's not even conquest, by the way. Even though there is a common assumption that at the time of the Maccabees, most notably Yochanan Hyrcanus, that there was a major conquest and forced conversion of those who were vanquished, those who were conquered. It doesn't hold a lot of water. By the way, I've taught that for years, that the Maccabees, the latter Maccabees, forcibly converted certain tribes. And then I read some research recently that says not necessarily the case, and with a compelling point that nowhere in Jewish sources does it mention that there were tribes that were forcibly converted. The Talmud doesn't mention it. Josephus doesn't mention it. And by the way, both of those sources have plenty to criticize the Maccabees about. So to say that there was conquest, yes, the Maccabee kingdom expanded, but to say that it added tremendous numbers doesn't hold water. So the conclusion that we have to come to, that we're almost forced to come to, and we're going to see, while we don't have direct evidence of it, we definitely have circumstantial evidence of it, was that there was mass conversion to Judaism during this time. Or I shouldn't necessarily say mass, but at least significant conversion to Judaism this time. And the three population centers of the Jewish world. So during the Second Commonwealth, the Jews were not centered only in Israel. Israel was just probably the small, or one of the smaller communities of the Jewish people. The Jews are still centered mainly in Babylon, with a community in Alexandria in Egypt. And it seems that in all these places that there were significant numbers of conversions to Judaism. Now, one thing that we don't find is that there was missionizing. Right? We always say that Judaism doesn't believe in missionizing. We don't believe in forced conversion. We don't believe in proselytizing. That's all true. And there is, and while there's plenty of historical evidence for these the tremendous population increase, there's zero that there was forced conversion, other than that one with Rabbi Yochanan Hyrcanus that I mentioned before, the Idumeans. But even that is argued upon and doesn't necessarily hold water. So it's interesting that there's this huge population increase. It seems that conversion has to be our answer as to where it came from, yet we do not find it mixed with proselytizing, which we would think would be the case. Because let's face it, how does Christianity end up going through a tremendous population growth? Through proselytizing. How does Islam end up going through a tremendous population growth? Through proselytizing, by the sword, right? Not necessarily by the book, but by the sword. But we don't find any evidence of that during this time period. So it's interesting. On one hand, our working hypothesis for tonight is that this mass population increase, 20x over 500 years, is caused by an influx of converts to Judaism. Yet we don't find any great movement of Jews to convert Jews, to proselytize. So, which makes the question a little more interesting. We're looking at conversion of our source of population growth, yet without any organized effort to bring in converts. So how do we understand this? So allow me to paint the picture allow me to paint the picture through our sages as to what was going on in sort of a metaphysical sense during this time period in history. And I'm going to start. I would like to start by quoting one section of the Talmud. This is the Talmud Gittin, which talks about Ravashi, who was one of the redactors, organizers of the Babylonian Talmud, and it tells a story that one day he was wrapping up his class, and he says, tomorrow we'll begin the lecture. We're talking about our colleagues, referring to the kings of Israel or the kings of Judah who were involved in idolatrous practice. So that night, one said king comes to him in a dream, the wicked king Manasseh. He comes to him in a dream. Comes to Ravashi in a dream, and in that dream, he flexes his halachic muscle, so to speak. In other words, he shows that he was a scholar. He's able to show that he knows more about Jewish law than Ravashi himself knew. To which point, Ravashi asks Manasseh the question. He says, Manasseh, I don't get it. King Manasseh. Now he has respect for him. He says he's a scholar. He says, King Manasseh, I don't get it. You're such a scholar, yet you were engaged in idol worship? Like, the two don't seem to go hand in hand. How is it that on one hand you were such a scholar, and on the other hand you were so involved in idol worship, right? The book of Kings describes that he prays to every idol he can find. How did you become such a person? So Manasseh says, back to Ravashi, says, you don't get it. You just don't get the situation. Had you been there at the time that we were alive and the time that I was on this planet, you would have taken the hem of your cloak and run after me to worship idols together with me. Very strange statement. Also says the next day he gave a little more respect to Manasseh in class. But what's going on over here? Manasseh is trying to, so to speak, explain his behavior during his lifetime as an idol worshiper, when criticized by Ravashi for being an idol worshiper, saying, you don't get how tough it was to not worship idols. Had you been alive, you would have run after these idols. In other words, what? What Manasseh was saying to Ravashi, what King Manasseh was saying to Ravashi, was that there was such a desire on the part of humankind to worship idols that you can't possibly understand the desire. And not only that, but had you been alive when that desire existed, you wouldn't have been able to withstand the desire to worship idols. Strange thing over here. So King Manasseh in the Talmud is telling Ravashi that the time when he was alive, circa, let's say 600 before the Common Era, there was such a tremendous inclination, desire on the part of human beings to worship idols that many people, like Manasseh, who himself was a scholar, couldn't resist the temptation and therefore became idolaters. Now, you might say, 1 second, if there's such a strong inclination to worship idols, then how is it that when I go into the Museum of Natural History and I see all of those idols from throughout world history, or I walk past a Buddha temple, which is like one of the one last idolatrous movements we have in the world today, or I see a Buddha on the shelf, I don't feel any desire to bow down to it or rub its belly, or like let's face it, when was the last time any of us felt any sincere drive, desire, want to worship idols? Yet King Manasseh is saying in his time it was so strong that the great Ravashi, had he been alive in his time, he would have also run after the idols. So let's put this into perspective. What happened to the desire to worship idols? So the Talmud in a couple places, in Sanhedrin and Yuma, tells us a story of the Anshe Knesset HaGadolah. The Anshe Knesset HaGadolah is often translated as the men of the Great Assembly. This was the governing body of the Jewish people at the beginning of the Second Commonwealth. So when the Jews come back to build the Second Temple with Ezra and Nehemiah, they organize a body called the Anshe Knesset HaGadolah, which was made up of 120 scholars, very righteous Jews, many of them prophets. The last of the prophets were part of that group. And by the way, the Knesset in Israel today is loosely based off of the Anshe Knesset HaGadolah. First of all, the name, Anshe Knesset HaGadolah, Knesset in Israel. The Anshe Knesset Gedola had 120 members. The Knesset in Israel today has 120 members, 120 prime ministers. The Anshe Knesset Gedola is made up of many righteous, sincere, dedicated Jews and scholars. The Knesset in Israel today has 120 members, and I think the comparison ends there. But be it as it may, during that time period, and the time when Nehemiah, the one who builds the second temple with Ezra, fights off the challenge from the Samaritans, they want to set up the second temple, the second commonwealth, for success. And they know that what were the issues that, so to speak, did in the first commonwealth. So it was our sages tell us that the Jews at that time, of the first commonwealth, were very involved in the Gimel Averos Yaharig Va'al Yavor. In other words, the three cardinal transgressions of Judaism, as they're often called, the three transgressions that a Jew is obligated to give up their life before practicing. So with the 610 commandments in the Torah, if somebody would, God forbid, come to any one of us, put a gun to our head and say, speak Lashon Hara, eat pig, desecrate Shabbos, whatever it is, or I'm going to kill you, we would violate the Torah before giving up our lives. If the same person comes to us and says, do one of these three things or I'm going to kill you, we would have to give up our life before doing these three things. And the three things are murdering another person, worshiping idols, and participating in the illicit relationships as they're spelled out in the Torah, right? Any of those three things are what we call Yaharig Val Yavor. We would have to give up our life before violating any of those three things. And our sages tell us that the Jews at the time of the first commonwealth were involved in these three transgressions, activities, whatever you want to call them, and that's what leads to the destruction of the first temple. So the Nehemiah and the men of the Great Assembly want to set up the second commonwealth for success. So they say, you know what we're going to do? We're going to convene a day or 3 fast days. And after those 3 fast days, we are going to pray to the Almighty, and we're going to ask him to eradicate these inclinations in mankind. So we're going to start with the inclination for idol worship, and they fasted for 3 days. And then they beseech the Almighty that the inclination for idol worship should be eradicated. And a note falls from heaven which says that their prayer says emes, the prayer was accepted. And then the Talmud describes that a fiery cub runs forth from the Kodesh Kodashim, that's the Holy of Holies in the temple. And they're able to catch the cub and put it in a certain box and lock it away. And that's the end of the inclination for idol worship. Now, there's a couple of interesting things here. First of all, that's why when you walk past a idol in the Museum of Natural History, or you walk past a Buddha or whatever it is, you feel no desire whatsoever to worship that idol. But what this section of the Talmud is telling us, that before Nehemiah and the men of the Great Assembly eradicated the inclination to be involved in idolatry, there was a tremendous inclination on the part of mankind to be involved in idol worship. So much so that our sages go on to talk about how they next eradicated the desire for illicit relationships. And the next day, what happened was there were no eggs in the chicken coop. In other words, humans and animals, everyone stopped procreating. So they said to at least give it back halfway. But we're to understand that just like humans have sexual desires, those were the similar desires that they had to be involved in idolatry. We don't get it because the desire was eradicated from mankind. But before this point in history, there was a tremendous desire, and that's what King Menashe was referring to. You're saying, I'm a scholar, but I had such a desire to worship idols, I couldn't fight it. You would have been able to fight it, and we wouldn't be able to fight it. But come along in the future, Nehemiah, the men of the Great Assembly, they eradicate the desire for idol worship in mankind. Now, parenthetically, there's another thing that goes out the window with idolatry, because we have some scientists here in the class with us. Ron Emmerman's here, but I don't know if we have any physicists. He's a doctor. He's a physician. But at least in physics, we have a concept of potential energy and kinetic energy, right? Like, for example, where have I created more potential energy? Here or here? Well, if you know anything about physics, you know that here there's more potential energy than here, because the reason is it can fall further. Here it can only fall this far. Here it can fall this far. So up here, there's much more potential energy than there is down here. Well, spirituality and metaphysics works the same way. So if we have the ability to fall further, that means we have the ability to climb higher, more potential energy. So when the floor is, so to speak, lifted up and the desire for idol worship is eradicated from mankind, well, there's a negative inverse to that. And that is also the end of prophecy, because we can't reach the same heights anymore, less potential energy, and therefore no one can reach the level of prophecy anymore, which prophecy was not a gift. It was something that was worked on. We talked about this in the heretics class. And from this point on, not only is there no inclination for idol worship, but there is also no more prophets. From this point on, Judaism is a non-profit organization. But okay, so that's what happens. Circa, we'll give it the year. So we understand this is the beginning of the Second Commonwealth. The Second Commonwealth begins in the year 350 before the Common Era. So somewhere in 4th century before the Common Era, such a thing happens. But it's not like the polytheists just wrap up and go home, right? It's not like the idol worshippers of the world just say, no more inclination for this, we're out of here. Because it's a big business, there's a lot more to it than just worshiping idols and the desire to worship idols. But bottom line is, we understand from that point in history, the desire on the part of human beings to worship idols or to be involved in polytheism, to be involved in paganism, is not there anymore. Now, yes, you might point out that there are still different polytheistic religions in the world today. There is, we referred to Buddhism before, which is a polytheistic religion, philosophy, whatever you want to call it. Hinduism has aspects of polytheism to it, for sure. And even certain branches of Christianity, while they are sort of what we'll call an imperfect monotheism, they definitely get pretty close to some polytheistic ideas. But that being said, the desire, just like I said, human beings have a sexual desire. We don't have that for idolatry anymore. And therefore, from that point in history on, we see that idolatry dwindles in the world. Because at that point in history, it was basically the Jews were the only monotheists, right? That was it. It was just us. And then everyone else on the map of the world was a polytheist. But we're going to see that start to crumble. And that is the beginning of what we'll call our Roman converts, or people coming over from the outside world to convert to Judaism. We don't hear a lot about converts before this. Again, last week we talked about Ruth. That was really an extenuating case. We don't hear a lot about converts to Judaism before this point in history. But at this point in history, we start hearing about converts to Judaism. So again, if we're lining up what we've done so far, we see from the year roughly 420 before the Common Era till the year 100 of the Common Era. In that 500-year period, we see the Jewish world population grow 20x, grow to almost 8 to 10 million. At the same time, we put on top of it this philosophical idea from our sages that the inclination for idolatry, and that's not just for Jews, by the way, that's in mankind, is eradicated. So what that means is, and we see at the same time, adding on now a third layer, that we hear of this at this time period, the first converts being mentioned in the Talmud and Josephus, people coming over to Judaism. So I think if you layer it all together, you can start to see where my philosophy, where my hypothesis is going, that tremendous population growth. Where does it come from? Well, the only conclusion that we have, really not necessarily by direct evidence, but by process of elimination, is it had to be conversion. And we see, it was also during this time period, is the first time really when we see tremendous numbers of converts. And we're going to see that even many of those numbers are tremendous aristocrats. The first of which, right in our title, they got title recognition, was Shemaiah and Avtalyon. Shemaiah and Avtalyon are at the same time period as Shimon ben Shetach, or they're just after Shimon ben Shetach, same time period as Shlomzion Hamalka, who we talked about in the Queen series, circa 100 before the Common Era. Now, who are Shemaiah and Avtalyon? Shemaiah and Avtalyon are either descendants of or converts themselves, and descend from Sancheriv, the Assyrian emperor, who wiped out the northern kingdom of Israel, who wiped out the 10 tribes, made them the 10 lost tribes. That's Sancheriv. Shemaiah and Avtalion are descendants of Sancheriv. And again, it's a little bit of a dispute if they themselves are converts or if they're the children or grandchildren of converts. But nonetheless, they are descendants of converts, and of not only converts, but aristocratic converts. Now, what's interesting is, coming from their background, and I think it's more interesting if we go with the opinion that they themselves are converts, that they rise to the position of what's called the Zugos. Now, after who we mentioned before, the Anshe Knesset Gedola, after it is a non-replacing body. So once they die out, they're not governing the Jewish people anymore. The leaders of the Jewish people become what is known as the Zugos. Now, the Zugos were both the Nasi and the Av Bezdin. The Nasi that translates as prince, or the president of the Sanhedrin, of the Jewish court, and the Av Bezdin was the head judge of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish court. These are like the two leading rabbis, and as pairs will lead the Jewish people through the next few generations. Shemaiah and Avtalion are the Zugos, the pairs at the time of Shlomzion Hamalka, Queen Shlomzion, and it's quite remarkable that they are either converts or descendants from converts, and they reach the level of being literally the leaders of the Jewish people, literally the chief rabbis. And it just goes to the point that we talked about last week, that Judaism is not a aristocracy, it's a meritocracy. So here you see converts, at least children of converts, reach the levels of being literally the leaders of the Jewish people, the chief rabbis of the Jewish people, and that just goes to show how this point of Judaism being a meritocracy. Okay, we're about halfway through here, so I want to pause just for any questions at this point. I see we have some in the chat box. How did the increase in population? Was there a decrease in infant mortality of Jewish babies? Again, Ron, we have no indication that the population growth was from anything to do with life expectancy, either a decrease in infant mortality or length of life. We have no indication of it being biological. Again, could have been, and we just don't have it, but there was no mention of it. Okay, there's Mikhail and like a dark Kodesh, and the global warming is worshiping global warming is idolatry. I don't have any comment about global warming per se, but I will say that that while there's no idols per se nowadays, there's definitely idols like money. There's things that we worship. But again, the point I'm making is the natural inclination towards polytheism that mankind had before this point doesn't exist after this point. Is Menashe the same one we pray? No, this Menashe is not the ones from the prayer of the blessing over boys that we say on Friday nights, Yisimcha Elokim Ke'Ephraim V'chi Menashe. That Menashe is in this week's Parsha, though. So very good, Janice. This week's Parsha, we have Joseph as the viceroy of Egypt and his two sons, who are Ephraim and Menashe. And that is why we give the blessing to our sons. They should be like Ephraim and Menashe, because they were the first two Jews raised in exile, and they remained sincere Jews. This King Menashe is named for that Menashe and was not a righteous Jew, but a totally different person. Okay, any other questions at this point? And by the way, we'll again have time for questions at the end, but at this point, any other questions? Okay, so we will continue. Okay. So Shemaiah and Avtalion are probably the first of our famous converts beginning the trend, circa the year 100, 110 before the Common Era. Now let's fast forward to the time period of the destruction of the temple, which is where our numbers tell us the population was so high. And we're going to see something that will, if you know Roman history or world history, might be a little bit of a different story than they told you in elementary school or high school or even college. And that is Nero, the Emperor Nero. Now, what happened to the Emperor Nero? Right, we all know he was crazy, and he was also a musician, because we know all great musicians are crazy. No, I'm just kidding. How's the famous line go? that Nero fiddled as Rome burnt. I think that's the line. And according to Roman sources, he was sentenced to death by the Roman Senate. He eventually committed suicide to avoid death by the Senate. And we see that Roman works, Dio Cassius and others, and subsequent Roman works are very, very critical of the Emperor Nero. But that's not the Jewish story, right? The Jewish story is often very different than the non-Jewish story than we find in the secular history books. What does the Talmud Gittin tell us about the Emperor Nero? The Talmud tells us that he was actually the first of the Roman emperors who came to Israel to try to subdue the rebellion of the Jews against the Romans. And the Talmud tells us that he comes to Israel and he enters the country and he shoots an arrow towards the east, and it fell in Jerusalem. And he shoots an arrow towards the west, and it fell in Jerusalem. And he goes in all four directions, and they all fall towards Jerusalem. So Nero's like, I guess this whole thing has something to do with Jerusalem. So he pulls aside a child, a school-aged child, and he says, "Child, tell me what verse you learned in school today." And the child quotes a verse from the prophet Ezekiel, saying, "And I will lay my vengeance upon Edom, Rome, by the hand of my people Israel." So Nero thinks for a minute. All these arrows are telling me to go to Jerusalem. But the prophet Ezekiel, who again has been gone for a couple hundred years now, he has a prophecy that says that the Jewish God is going to take out his vengeance on the people of Rome. And Nero starts to put two to two together and says, the Holy One, blessed be he, wants his temple destroyed. And he wishes to wipe his hands with this man. And he wants to pin it on me. So Nero says, I'm not going to be that guy. And the Talmud goes on to tell us that he goes on and converts to Judaism. And the famous Rebbe Meir is a descendant of Nero. So again, Roman sources don't have a lot nice to say about Nero. He was sentenced to death. He committed suicide to avoid it. He fiddled while Rome burned. Not a lot of nice things to say. Of course, they have nothing nice to say about him because he went to destroy, to put down the rebellion of the Jews against the Romans. And what does he do? He joins the enemy. He becomes Jewish. So it's only to be expected that Roman sources would have not that nice of things to say about the Emperor Nero, who became a member of the tribe. Fast forward just a little bit. We have probably, I would say, one of the most famous of the converts at this time, and that is a convert known as Onkelos Hager, Onkelos the convert. Now, one of the reasons he's so famous is because after he converts to Judaism, he writes an Aramaic translation of the Chumash. Now, Aramaic was the lingua franca of Jews of the time. So he basically writes the first art scroll. And we know that every translation is really a commentary as well. So he writes the first really substantial, authoritative Aramaic translation of the Chumash. And to this day, when you open a Chumash, I'll show you right here from the Chumash here on my desk. To this day, see if we can get a clear picture. Right, this is a Chumash here, an art scroll Chumash right here. This is the words of the Chumash. Sorry, this is the words of the Torah right here. This is Onkelos's translation. And on virtually every Chumash you ever look at, not every Chumash, but most Chumashim you look at, we have the Aramaic translation of Onkelos that's still right there in the Talmud. So very significant, very famous because he becomes one of his translation, his Aramaic translation becomes one of the main commentaries on the Chumash, on the Torah that we use until this day. Question is, where does he come from? So according to the Talmud, he is the nephew of the Emperor Hadrian. Now, Hadrian is the emperor of the Roman Empire after the destruction of the Second Temple and after the Bar Kokhba revolt. So quick history of that time, if you're not familiar with it, the temple was destroyed in 70 of the Common Era. The Jews are still found in Israel during this time. They're able to regroup and regather for another rebellion against the Romans roughly 50 years later that's led by a man by the name of Shimon Bar Kokhba. And the revolt is eventually put down in the year 135. And at which point the Romans say, we're done with these Jews. Like there's no letting them stay in Israel. We're wiping them off the face of world history. So they plow over the Temple Mount to make it look as if there's never a temple there, like some people try to do today. They changed the name of the country from Yehuda, which is what it was called during the Second Commonwealth, to Philistia, which eventually becomes Palestine. Philistia and Palestine is the same thing. So if you ever wonder where the name Palestine comes from, it's the name that the Romans put on the land of Israel to de-Judaize the land. Again, there's some people today who try to de-Judaize the land a little bit and use that name. Okay, we're not getting too political today. That's McKill's job, not mine. But be it as it may, if you ever wonder where the term Palestinian or Palestine comes from, that was a name that the Romans put on the country to de-Judaize the land, and they took it from the Philistines, who were the last known of the Canaanite tribes to be in Israel. And they go on a mission, and they make Jerusalem the first Judenrein Jewish city in world history. They kick all the Jews out of Jerusalem, change the name to Lea Capitolina, the capital city, and that's what they do in Israel. Now, they also go on a mission to totally wipe out Judaism, and they make it illegal to teach Torah, illegal to learn Torah, and it's during this time period that we have what's known as the Asara Haruge Malchus, the 10 martyrs, the 10 great rabbis who continued to try and teach Torah, and they were martyred by Hadrian. The most famous of which is the great Rebbe Akiva, and probably his students, is when his students perished as well. Rebbe Akiva is martyred in the Hippodrome in Caesarea, if you've ever been there. But this is all perpetrated by Hadrian, the Emperor Hadrian. The Hadrianic decrees, we refer to it as. Hadrian has a nephew by the name of Unclus. Right? Our famous Unclus Hager is the nephew of Hadrian. So he goes to Hadrian as emperor, his uncle, and he's already started to to look into Judaism just a little bit. And he goes to his uncle for advice. He doesn't know what to do, so he goes to his uncle and he says, "Uncle, my dear uncle, I want some advice on business. I want to get involved in business." To which the emperor says, "Well, what do you get involved in business for? Do you not have enough gold and silver and jewels?" He said, "I want to get involved in business. Can you give me some business advice?" To which Hadrian advises him the age-old business adage: buy low, sell high. Right? We all know. My father's in the classroom. My father's a retired financial advisor. He'll tell you buy low, sell high. The problem is, figuring out what's low and what's high, right? And if we can figure that out, then then I get a much better paying job. But buy low, sell high. That the first person, to my knowledge, in world history to give that advice was Hadrian, giving the advice to his nephew Unclus, and he says fine. So he comes back a few, days, weeks, months later, and he tells his uncle, he says, "Uncle, I have some bad news for you. I'm converting to Judaism." He says, "Well, what do you mean you're converting to Judaism?" I'm like, "Hey, I've been trying to wipe Judaism off the face of the planet. What do you mean you're converting to Judaism?" He said, "Well, I'm just following your advice. You told me to convert to Judaism." He said, "Me, I didn't tell you to convert to Judaism. What are you talking about?" He said, "Yeah, you did. You said buy low, sell high. And which people in the world today is more downtrodden than the Jewish people? Because, they're being despised and wiped out everywhere. So they're definitely the lowest of people. So it's got to be that that's low, and their stock can only increase. So therefore, I'm joining the Jewish people." And he goes off to go to yeshiva to convert to Judaism. Obviously, Hadrian's not very happy about this. It's definitely a blemish on the shield of the Roman emperor to hear he's trying to wipe out Judaism, the Jewish people, and his nephew's trying to convert to Judaism. And he sends a number of palace guards or Roman guards to try and bring Unclus back, so to speak, to bring him back. And the first group of guards goes and finds Unclus in the yeshiva and tries to bring him back to Rome with them. And Unclus successfully convinces them to convert to Judaism. At which point, Hadrian says, "Okay, that was a fluke. I'm sending another group to get my nephew back." And he sends another group of Roman soldiers to bring Unclus back. And sure enough, Unclus gets into conversation with them and convinces them to convert to Judaism. So Hadrian says, "Okay, this isn't going well." He gets a third group of soldiers. He says, "Guys, I need you to go to Rome, and I need you to go to Israel or Palestine and get my nephew, but don't talk to him. Do not engage him in conversation. Don't let him talk to you. You don't talk to him. Not a word to him on the whole trip." So the soldiers go and they find Onkelos and they grab him. And as they're walking through the doorway of the study hall, they see Onkelos reach up towards the mezuzah to kiss the mezuzah. And the soldiers say, well, what are you doing? And he goes on to describe the practice of the mezuzah, how it guards our homes, how it reminds us of God's presence. It gets into conversation, and sure enough, they convert too. At which point, Hadrian totally gives up, and he just disowns his nephew. And at that point, his nephew is Onkelos. Badum ching. His name is Onkelos, don't get me wrong, but he was Onkelos at that time. He didn't have an uncle anymore, okay? Because Hadrian disowns him. But again, we see here a trend that is starting to play out, that there's no more desire for idol worship in the world. So even in the Roman Empire, where there's a lot of interaction between Jews and Romans, from the time of the Hasmoneans, from the time of the Maccabees up until this time period now, a lot of interaction between the Jews and the Romans. And they have no desire for idol worship anymore. So as the intellectual conversations start, we see the Romans start to convert to Judaism en masse. And even it gets into the aristocracy with people like Nero, with people like Onkelos, before that was Shemaiah and Naftalion, and that becomes a trend in the Roman Empire. Now, you might say, as I kind of threw out as an idea for this class, is we're going to talk about how Rome almost became Jewish. And the answer is, well, why didn't it become Jewish? Because the numbers, let's just go back to the numbers for a minute. There's about 8 to 10 million Jews in the Roman Empire at this point. How many people are in the Roman Empire at this point? Well, probably about 55 to 60 million. So you do your math, more than 10% of the Roman Empire is Jewish. I mean, never before, except in Israel, have we had that much. I mean, I shouldn't say never before. In Poland, it was definitely like that. But still, we were 10% of the free world, 10% of the Roman Empire at that point. Question is, why does it not become Jewish? The simple answer, and I believe the true answer, is that in the year 312, when Constantine becomes the emperor, he brings with his throne, with his crown, Christianity. So Christianity offers the Roman Empire, which was looking for something, because paganism was bankrupt at that point, they're looking for something. It offers them the concepts of ethical monotheism without having to get a bris milah, without having to get circumcised, without having to keep kosher, keep Shabbos, go to the mikvah. Like, yeah, didn't have to do any of that stuff. So it was a way to sort of have their cake and eat it too, to have sort of the ethical, philosophical ideas of Judaism without having the rigor and the challenge to their lifestyle, at least, of having to follow the mitzvos. So that, my friends, is what I believe happened. And that's, by the way, the same way that Judaism took on like wildfire in the Roman Empire and gets to the point of 10% of the empire. That's why when Christianity comes along 200 years later, as a force to be reckoned with. Now, Christianity, what we're going to talk about for the last few moments, starts before this point, but it was a force to reckon with, and for sure when the emperor becomes Christian, that's it. They were looking and waiting for something that it just fell right in, became part and parcel of the Roman Empire. Roman Empire becomes Christian, and that's how Christianity made it in the world. And hey, we're still like 10 to 12 million down here like we were at that point. Last question we're going to close with, because it connects to, as I said before, Inyani Dioma, it connects to ideas in the Jewish calendar that are going on right now. Friday is the fast of Asara B'Teves. Yes, Friday is also December 25th, but it's also the fast of Asara B'Teves. And the fast of Asara B'Teves is an interesting one. That's just the name on the calendar, the 10th of Teves. The main reason we fast on the 10th of Teves is because that was the day that Nebuchadnezzar, when he destroys the first temple, that he lays siege on Jerusalem. Now, many people think he laid siege on the 10th of Teves, he broke through the walls in Tammuz, and he destroyed the temple on Tisha B'Av. That's true, but the last two events were 2.5 years later. The siege is about almost a 3-year siege, 2.5-year siege, before he breaches the walls and then destroys the first temple. And that's the main reason we're going to fast on the 10th of Teves. But There's a lot of Jewish sources say that there's other calamities, like with many of other fast days, there's other calamities we lump together. One calamity is on the 8th of Teves, which is tonight and tomorrow. This is when the Septuagint was completed. The Septuagint was the Targum Shivim, was the translation of the Torah into Greek, commissioned by the Ptolemaic Empire, that we look at as both a miraculous time period and a tragic time period. It was miraculous because the Greek King Ptolemy, the Greek Egyptian King Ptolemy, commissioned 72 rabbis to translate the Torah into Greek for him, and he puts them into 72 different rooms in order to, so they shouldn't be able to collaborate, so he should make sure to get an honest translation. And those 72 rabbis all come out with the exact same translation, all with calculated mistranslations. So 72 rabbis go into 72 different rooms and all agree. And that's a miracle. You know, they say it's a miracle, but that's not such a miracle. You put 72 rabbis in 72 different rooms and get them to agree. Try putting 72 rabbis into the same room and get them to agree, and that'll be a miracle. But be it as it may, the Targum Shivim is also looked at as a tragedy because it's looked at as one of the first harbingers or first steps to help the Jews assimilate into Greek culture, which leads to Hanukkah, which we just celebrated. So that's the 8th of Teves, that's tonight. So we're going to remember that on the fast day on Friday. What about the 9th of Teves? 9th of Teves is mentioned also as a day of tragedy, but the reason isn't so clear. It's not in early sources, and it's only when we have to piece together later sources to figure it out. One of the reasons, by the way, there are certain sources that say that the reason is because it was the original December 25th. In other words, it was Jesus' birthday. And there's so much bloodshed, that, like right now we thank God live in a wonderful time with our Christian cousins, with our Christian neighbors, but this was not always the case in world history. As we know, there's plenty of Jewish bloodshed in the name of Jesus, in the name of Christianity. So some sources say that the 9th of Teves was the day that Jesus was born, and that's one of the calamities we remember on the 10th of Teves. But there's another one. There's a strange one, that there's a man by the name of Shimon HaKalfus, who's mentioned as it's his yard site. So to remember him, we fast. Who is Shimon HaKalfus? There's no mention of Shimon HaKalfus in the Talmud. There's no mention of Shimon HaKalfus anywhere in Jewish sources. There's only one, or a handful of places, but probably only one place where you'll really find the name Shimon HaKalfus. And that is where? That's in a book known as Toldos Yeshu HaNatzri. Now, what is Toldos Yeshu HaNatzri? Toldos means like the happenings, the descendants, the events of the life of Yeshu HaNatzri. Who is Yeshu HaNatzri? That's what we Jews call Jesus, Jesus of Nazareth. Yeshu, by the way, the name Yeshu comes from the acronym Yamach Shemo V'Zichron, which means his name should be obliterated from history. Okay, not so politically correct, but hey, I like to say not so politically correct things sometimes when Mikhail doesn't want to. So anyways, but Toldos Yeshu HaNatzri. What is this book, Toldos Yeshu HaNatzri? Toldos Yeshu HaNatzri is essentially the Jewish response to the Christian Bible. Right? The Christian Bible tells one story of Jesus. The book Toldos Yeshu HaNatzri tells the Jewish story of who Jesus really was. Now, as I'm sure you can imagine, this book is hard to come by. It's not. It's not widely printed or widely disseminated, but you can. But there are definitely manuscripts of it around. There's some discrepancies between different ones, but the general idea is thus: that the early days of Christianity was a Jewish movement. We see that in many places in the Talmud, and we see that essentially they were a messianic movement, and but they continued to follow Judaism. But they believed that their Messiah had come and died and was going to come back. Okay, mentions a lot of Jewish groups who like to believe this throughout time. But that was essentially what the early Christians believed. They still kept Shabbos, they still kept kosher, they still daven, they still wore tefillin. They just believed that their Messiah hadn't fulfilled the job. He died, he was going to come back and be the Messiah. And that was their belief. The rabbis at the time felt this was very dangerous and felt that they had to do something about this. So they decided that one of the rabbis needed to infiltrate the early Christians and, so to speak, move it away from Judaism, make it a different religion, make the demarcations clear, and make it clear that this was not a Jewish sect. It was a totally different religion. So one of those rabbis by the name of Shimon HaKalfus, again, recorded in the Toldos Yeshu HaNatzri, Shimon HaKalfus is the one who is volunteer for the job. And he says, okay, I'll do this if all you rabbis will guarantee that I have a wonderful place in the world to come. Fine, they give him the guarantee. He goes on, he's able to infiltrate the early Christians, and through his infiltration, he's able to move them away from Judaism. He's able to move them away from the observance of Jewish law. He gives them a new law set. He's, according to Todos Yeshua Nesri, he writes the New Testament. He organizes the New Testament. And like that, he's able to make a clear distinction, demarcation between Judaism and Christianity. This is what we refer, this is his name in these Jewish sources, Shimon HaKalfus. What is his name in Christian sources? In Christian sources, his name is Peter the Apostle. So that's this is an idea brought down in Jewish sources that Peter the Apostle was commissioned by the rabbis, was charged with the rabbis to make the clean break between Judaism and Christianity, but he himself remained a sincere Jew his whole life, so much so that on Shabbos morning in Pezuki de Zimra, the introductory section, the last prayer we say, a prayer known as Nishmas, which also finds its place in the Passover Haggadah, that according to some Jewish sources, Machzor Vitri and others, that the Nishmas prayer was actually written by Shimon HaKalfus, a.k.a. Peter the Apostle. So that just gives you a picture of the landscape. Again, we started, I'll just summarize quickly, and then we'll get to our concluding questions. We started with the problem that historians are kind of baffled with, is how do we see this tremendous population growth of the Jewish people from the destruction of the first temple through from the destruction of the first temple to the destruction of the second temple, and by process of elimination, we have to say it was mass conversion. And when we start to layer other things of the time, first of all, the eradication of the desire to follow to practice idolatry, and we see the first mentioning of converts, not only converts, but aristocratic converts and significant converts. We start to layer it all together that this population growth must have come through the desire of the Roman Empire for something, for meaning, because they didn't have a desire for idol worship anymore, so they gravitate towards Judaism. And once Christianity is presented to them after Shimon HaKalfus, aka Peter the Apostate, Peter the Apostle, is able to take it and make a different religion, but still has enough similar philosophies that they're going to gravitate towards that because they don't have to get circumcised, they don't have to keep Shabbos, they don't have to keep kosher, they don't have to pay for kosher meat, and that's why they're going to go in that direction. So that's just the story of the converts from the Roman Empire during this time period of what my hypothesis my hypothesis continues to be a time period of mass conversion to Judaism, the greatest amount of conversion ever on the map of world history. Okay, I see we already have a bunch of questions in the chat box. Let's start with that. I'm sure we spawned a few others here. So let's go to the chat box here. Okay, so Joanne asks, it's interesting though that Christian sources don't focus on Nero converting as another way to attack Jews. Yeah, the Christian sources don't mention this. It's only the Talmud. It's just the Talmud that tells us that Nero converted. Is there any documentation that some of the Jewish Italian community today comes from these early converts? Well, I think if we do our math, we all come from these early converts to a certain extent. In other words, the numbers, again, we don't have direct documentation. These are hypothesis and circumstantial evidence and sort of deducting the facts. But if you go from 500,000 to 10 million in 500 years, that means we all have blood of these converts, these Roman converts in us. They'd be completely a part of, integrated and inculcated with the Jewish people. So I don't know that there's any direct correlation between the Italian community of today and these early converts. And Deanne asks, did I say prayer 19? I said prayer Nishmas, it's called. And if you happen to have an Art Scroll prayer book handy, I'll give you the page number of the prayer. It's a beautiful prayer. It's an absolutely beautiful prayer. And it really just sums up the idea of praising the Almighty for everything we have. It's page 400 in the Art Scroll Siddur if you want to look at it. 400 on the Hebrew side, 401 on the Hebrew side, and it goes on to the next page. By the way, Art Scroll does not bring down this idea, I don't think. They don't mention Peter the Apostle. This is other sources that say it. So that's the Nishmas prayer. Okay, any other questions, comments, concerns, good jokes, bad jokes, any jokes? Okay, then. Well, one second. Genetically, European Jews are more closely related to Italian than Semitic populations. That's interesting. That's interesting that the DNA of Eastern European Jews is closer to Italians than to the Semitic populations. Yeah, the DNA research is always fascinating. When we get next week, by the way, next week we'll just plug next week's class really quick. Next week we're going to talk about the kingdom of the Khazars and their mass conversion to Judaism. Khazars that's basically Kazakhstan, modern day Kazakhstan. Yes, I think that's why Sacha Baron Cohen.
No. That's way more west than Kazakhstan.
Isn't it more Georgia?
No, it's more north than Georgia. It's where Volgograd, ex-Stalingrad is. So it's north of Caucasus, southern Russia.
Okay, so we'll
parts of Ukraine.
We'll debate the geography of it a little bit next week, but what's interesting is the people of the Khazars or descendant of the Khazars do not have DNA evidence of ever being Jewish. But again, they don't have to, because if they were a tribe or a kingdom that converts together, they're not going to have DNA that looks like yours and ours if we don't have any evidence that tribe or kingdom later intermarried with the rest of the Jewish people. But next week will be the discussion of the Khazars, and we'll see exactly where they came from, and that'll be next week. But yeah, DNA evidence of Jewish, it's I'll just say one more thing on this, that when we talk about the time period of the Spanish expulsion, like we gave a session on a number of weeks ago, that they say today by DNA research, you'd be hard pressed to find a Spaniard today that doesn't have Jewish DNA. Because when you have roughly 100,000 to 200,000 Jews who convert to Catholicism and still remain a part of the Spanish Spanish Empire at the time, then you're going to have a lot of Jewish blood in Spain, and therefore you'd be hard pressed today to find a Spaniard who does not have Jewish DNA, Jewish blood. In fact, during World War II, that the emperor, the king, whatever his name, of Spain, I'm blanking on his name. But he was basically part of the Axis. So we'll say he was part of the Axis. He was definitely not part of the Allied forces. He was aligned with Axis and with Hitler and with Mussolini. When Hitler insisted that he implement the Nuremberg laws and turn over the Jews that were in Spain for extermination, King Franco, thank you. So he did not do it. He never did it. He would never turn over the Jews of Spain to Hitler. And when asked, like, why, you're fascist, you're not such a nice guy, he said, because by Hitler's account, I'm probably also Jewish, which was probably true. He probably had a Jewish grandparent or great grandparent, or definitely had a lot of Jewish blood, and that's the case for all of Spain today, because that's what happens when you have this mass conversion of Jews the other way. So too in this direction, when we have this mass conversion to Judaism, that means I would say we all have Roman blood in us. Which playing against what we talked about last week, the idea of picking up the pieces of Terach's family and with Lot and his daughters and Ruth and all that. We're picking up the pieces of Esau. Because Edom, which is Rome, is Esau. That's we look at that as Esau's nation, our uncle Esau. That's his nation. So when we talk about the Christian world today, I was talking about this in class earlier today, that the Christian world is Rome, and therefore when we want to say where's Esau today, well that's the Christian world. That's America. Now again, we have a great relationship today with Esau, which through certain times in history have had a great relationship with Esau and shall continue. But I'll tell you one interesting connection point is, in general, you look throughout history, and there's been many nations that use the eagle as their symbol. I don't know if the Romans were the first, but the Romans definitely, the Roman eagle was the symbol of the Roman Empire. And later, Hitler, Yamach Shemo, used it as a symbol of the Third Reich in Germany, and in America, it's used as a symbol. So there are those who would like to posit that that's really was the symbol of Esau. The eagle was the symbol of Esau and Edom, And therefore, when we see that eagle, it's not so much the symbol of strength and whatever it represents in America, but it's linking back to Aesop. Okay, don't have a lot of research on this. I'm just throwing out a hypothesis, maybe a topic for another class. But that's where we see the Christian world today. So, okay, any more questions before we wrap it up tonight? Okay, well, next week we'll talk about the kingdom of the Khazars. And I want to wish you all a wonderful evening. And we'll feel free to email me, text me with any other questions you have. Ron's just throwing in over there that Ben Franklin wanted to make the American bird a turkey. Yeah, that would have really frightened all of them. Make a turkey as your national bird. Yeah, maybe one of these days we'll give a class on if turkey's really kosher or not. That's another fun one. Maybe we'll touch on that at some point. By the way, yes, I eat turkey. It's kosher in my book, but it is a discussion. It is a discussion. So we'll talk about that at another point. Yeah, so okay, so I thank you all. I wish you all a great week, and we will talk to you more next time. Thank you.